with our talk that I will give together with Vesna about language resources and translation studies, search, find, archive, and share. Some of these information that you have heard in the previous talk will pop up also in our talk, but we will put these into the context of the life cycle of language resources. So we have heard a lot of the times the term language resources, and we will briefly go through the different definitions that are seen in the literature. What is a language resource? And then we will come to the language resource management cycle and how infrastructures such as CLARIN can help with all the different steps in this management cycle to search, find, create, use, archive, and share your resources. And in the end, we hopefully will give you an overview of the benefits that a researcher or a trainer will have when they will use the CLARIN infrastructure, and we will have some conclusions. So language resources are language data that are in digital and machine readable form. So this is the most common definition of language resources, that is only the language data in a machine readable form. But there is also a different definition of language resources that not only includes the data, but also the tools and other things like standards or annotation frameworks, so that all these together are also language resources in a broader sense, and not only in the restricted sense that it's only the data, but also the tools to process this data, and also the standards that the data are interoperable with different schemes, with different tools, and so on. In the sense of data, language resources are mostly seen as corpora, as we have seen already. So we see written corpora, spoken corpora. These corpora can be monolingual, bilingual, multilingual. They can be parallel corpora or even comparable corpora. Then there is this special language resource type that we as translations, these scholars or trainers are familiar with, are the translation memories. We have termbases, so terminological databases, lexica, digital dictionaries, ontologies, and so on. So these are all examples for language resources. As we have also heard in the first talk, language to create and process these data to form a language resource is often time-consuming and costly, and it can involve legal challenges and also sometimes technical challenges. So in times of time-consuming and costly, it is important that you see these language resources in this data management cycle, so that you first, before you have this intent to create a resource, go out there and look if this resource is not already built by somebody else and search for it. Then you can find it in the management. Then you can, if you search it and you find it, then you don't have to create it again, but you can reuse it. You can then, if you have enriched these resources, you can archive it, and then at the last point you can share it. With all these different steps, there are challenges involved, and there are tools and knowledge involved where a research infrastructure can step in and help you out. In different steps, you can use the research infrastructure. In other steps, you are on your own, so to say. So a research infrastructure, as we have seen, are in the digital notion, the roads and bridges and the cables that we have in the real life, that our real life is working. And for the research, it's the facilities and resources and services that the scientific community can do their research. So it facilitates the research and also is a source for knowledge and knowledge sharing. But even if it's called research infrastructure, it's not only for the researchers, but it also can be used for teaching purposes. So now we will go up the whole life cycle and go to the different steps in the different life cycle, and we will explain these different steps and the relation, how these different steps can be connected to the research infrastructure, and how the tools in the research infrastructure can help you to perform your tasks. So for the search, there are two different approaches to do searches. There is the strategy of lookup. So you have a specific goal and you want to get an answer to a question, or you want to find a specific fact. And there is this other search, the so-called explorative search. That is where you're not really sure what you want to find, but it's really an open-ended search, because you're like step by step you go further. And for this explorative search, you can use faceted search, so that you have different parameters, such as language, for example, or the resource type, and that then you narrow down your exploration. For the different use cases in FIND, use case 1, finding a language resource, and use case 2, finding elements within a resource, I will hand over to my colleague.
Okay, I want to show you now just briefly in a theoretical sense and with some very familiar screenshots that already Daria has showed you. And then in the later afternoon session you will get a hands-on possibility to work with these scenarios. So of course, first of all, you often want to look up if there is a resource that you could use, that you have not heard of it, so you want to find a language resource. This would be a use case 1, where you want to get a touch and feel if this is already existing in the community, or as Daria has pointed out before, you give your PhD student the challenge of combining a corpus, maybe they should find a possible language resource in CLARIN repositories or in the catalog. The other case is where you already know what you're looking for, more in the terms of keywords or specific linguistic elements. This is very relevant for us translators, right? We are looking for a specific word, for asylum, for example, or something that pops up in our translation problem. And here you could go, for example, in the resource per se and look in the resource for this specific keyword. And I want to give you some examples of how this can be done in CLARIN. The first possibility that Daria already presented is the one that you go to your either national repository or the repository that deals with your language combination or with your research questions or similar. You can find, as Daria has showed you, the whole list of different centers and repositories on the website of the CLARIN, but we will also have a detailed look at this. So one possibility would be to have a look in the repository what kind of language resources are available there. What is important here with the repositories is that they also preserve, manage, and provide access to these language resources, that they give you the possibility to find the resource, but that they also give you the persistent identifier so that you can find the same resource another time and that your fellow colleagues, that you want them to point out this resource, or if you use it in your research, that you can say, I found it here, and if you publish, for example, this in a journal or similar, all of your colleagues that will read your paper will get to the very same resource in the same form. So in this way, data can be cited, which sometimes is quite problematic for us, as you know. Another thing that repositories allow us is the so-called long-term preservation. What this is, let me say, quite open, what long-term preservation means, but in general it means that your data or other data will be available for several years in this data center. So first of all, your data, if you deposit it in such a repository, will be found by other researchers, or if you cite the data, it will still be there. So some examples are the CLARIN centers for such repositories, but also maybe some of you know Zenodo as another possibility. Or maybe some of your institutions have your institutional repositories. For example, my institution, University of Vienna, has an institutional repository. A problem of such a repository is everybody at my institution deposits data here. So it's from all kinds of domains, in all kinds of languages. It's not just data that would be interested for me, but also for my fellow colleagues in the biology department, for example, and so on and so forth. So what CLARIN does here, it picks up the data that may be relevant for you. And this is definitely a benefit for such repository which is also in such a network environment. Another possibility how to find a resource if you don't know if it exists or not is also through one of these aggregators, one of them being CLARIN Virtual Language Observatory, also already shown today. Here, as was already said before, you don't need to know which repository hosts this this language repository. You just look for it. The search is, let me say, a bit different depending on what you're looking for, how you want to look for it, and we want to show you this, how to do it then in the afternoon session so that you are then familiar with this search. You must know that this way of searching does not contain the data per se, so you just get the metadata that the language resource exists and points you to the direction where you can find it. But here is the aggregated way of looking through all the different resources. So this is another way how to find a language resource or see if maybe there's a gap you want to fill with your resource. Another possibility, which was already also shown today, is the so-called content search. This is also an aggregator type of search, but it doesn't aggregate just the metadata of the language resources, but the resources per se, meaning I'm afraid you cannot see this, but I searched for asylum here, and it shows me where asylum comes in different language resources in the CLARIN resources. So this is also a useful first step if you want to get a touch and feel for the language resource, if you want to see how the language resource looks like. In the next step, you can also download your search. So this is only this part that is shown to you. You can download it in various formats if you want to, for example, document this. But then in the next step, when you decide, yes, this language resource looks quite promising to me, you can go in the specialized repository and look in this resource. So this is just kind of like to get a first impression of the various resources that are available here. All right, then another possibility of what CLARIN infrastructure offers you are the various specialized searches that specialized repositories offer. I see that some colleagues are already familiar with this one. We just picked it from a language that we don't speak, but it looked interesting to us. Here is an example of corpus of the contemporary Lithuanian language. Here you would need to go to the website or the repository of the National Consortium and use their search. So another possibility is that you work in one of the repositories and see what they offer for this specific resource or similar. Another one that may be familiar to Daria is one example from the Slovene CLARIN, but for example they also host the EU DGT parallel corpora or translation memories. Here we search again for asylum in English and then in aligned German corpus. So this is something that is offered by the national consortium in Slovenia. So you see, it's not necessarily only Slovene based, but here we have an example how you can do a content search between English and German, and of course also, if I'm not mistaken, all the EU languages are represented here. So this is another way how you can already use the research without, research infrastructure without downloading anything to your computer, without going to Slovenia and consulting the colleagues, but you just log in and you can use all these fantastic services throughout Europe. Another possibility, of course, is that you don't find anything that is useful for your research. It can happen, of course. We only have in the infrastructure what has been deposited. So another possibility would be that you use the CLARIN tools to create your own collections or your own language resources from scratch. Here you can, of course, combine parts of the language resources that you find in the CLARIN infrastructure. You annotate them, or you process them as you please, or you do your own collection from scratch. For this, CLARIN also has some tools. We have already showed you briefly some of them, and we will also work with some of them. Webly has been already promoted. That's why I will just show you another tool that is provided by the colleagues in Spain, for example. So here you have a tool that is provided by Catalan group, as you see, also powered by CLARIN. The tool is called Conta Words. Here you just upload your file. It can be also PhD or similar, and then you get different linguistic analysis, lemmas, tokenizers, and so on and so forth. Here I just, for example, picked up the nouns from a PDF document that I've uploaded. So this is a very simple service, for example, available within the CLARIN community. Also very useful for students because you don't need to download anything. It's an online service that is available for free for the community. All right, another possibility, of course, is that you use the tools or the resources that you find throughout CLARIN in your research. I just picked out some examples and linked them to concrete resources that are stored in the CLARIN repositories. Here we have a study, again, a language that is not, I think, represented in this room, on Finnish, corpus-based study on cohesion in subtitles, linked to the resource that you will also find in the VLO, the Finnish Broadcasting Company corpus of subtitles. So you see also a bit of multimodality that is represented here. Then another resource that was used recently in the book Corpus Linguistic for Translation and Contrastive Studies, multilingual parallel corpus of legal text, was also cited in the book directly. So this is also a nice linking of the physical book with the digital word of such a legal corpus. Another example from our home territory, it was mentioned before, Arabic. This is a specialty of the Academy of Vienna. Here we have a Tunico corpus, and then just an article that is based on this language resource and of course cited, and so on and so forth. So you see here we have a nice mixture of the physical in the books and journals, and then the actual language resources that your colleagues can of course find again without problem. Another possibility of research, and this is something that is also possible in the infrastructure is more of how to assess the availability of language resources for specific user groups. I myself was involved in this research, and here we were looking at resources for machine translation, as was already asked here. So to have a meta level or meta view on what is available. You can also do a nice study with the infrastructure, what is available for which languages, how often it's used, and so on and so forth, just to give you another view of what the possibilities in terms of research also are. Last but not least, I will just mention it briefly. We use a lot of resources available through CLARIN also in the classroom. I myself, I teach technology-related courses and information-related courses, and here we have 14 languages represented in our classroom. So this is a very, very rich resource how to bring all the students with all their different language combinations on board so that they can also find their own resources. We will give you more details on this then tomorrow, what's possible here. All right, next in the step, when you've done your research, when you collected your resources and so on, or you created your own resource, is archiving, and Tanya will tell you a bit more on this.
So when you have put so much effort in creating your resource and analyzing your resource, you don't want that your resource get lost, and so you want to archive your resource. And archiving means that you deposit it in an archive or repository, and this ensures that the data is archived, and also that when, for example, the format is changing, the tools are changing, that this archive is taking care of the conversion so that the files are not only there in digital format but are also readable in the times to come. So we have already heard about repositories. There are different types of repositories: the institutional repositories, domain-specific repositories, and infrastructure repositories. They can also be a mix of these different repositories. The CLARIN infrastructure has the infrastructure repositories. They have these depositing services. But as we have seen, these services are not operating on the top CLARIN level, but they are based in the national centers, these depositing services. But since they are in these infrastructure, they are connected to each other. What a alone standing institutional repository doesn't have. So if you don't know that a resource is in this specific institutional repository, you will not discover it. So you have to go directly to this repository and look in this repository. If you are looking for resources in in infrastructure repositories, they are all connected together, and so you don't have to know where to go in which repository, but you will find the resource if it's in one of these repositories. Domain-specific repositories have the advantage that they specifically build to cater for your needs, for your data formats, for your metadata requirements, and so on. And so in these domain-specific repositories, most of the time you can enter more granularly your metadata, so the chance that somebody can find your resource and can assess it and finds it more useful because it has more metadata is greater than in a general repository, because then you have to stick to metadata that caters for all different disciplines. So the CLARIN depositing services, as we have heard several times, is decentralized in these different CLARIN centers, and there at the website you can access the list of these centers. And it's not that you have to stick to your center. So it doesn't mean that if you are in Austria, you have to deposit it with an Austrian center. You can also go to another center because your resource fits there better. And it does not mean that if we are in Austria, all our resources in the repository are German. So the language of the resource that is deposited has not to be matched with the country of the repository. So it can be really different combination, as we have seen also for the resources in the CLARIN, in the Slovene CLARIN consortium, that there are multilingual resources there, and it does not have to be matched. So that you think I have to go to the Lithuanian consortium to have Lithuanian resources, or for example, we as an Austrian institute, we have Arabic and Persian resources, and so it does not match. After archiving, you have you also want to share your resources, and this sharing is more easily doable if you have deposited your resources before, because then the resource is citable because it gets a persistent identifier. It is shown, I have it here, that you have here the persistent identifier, so an URL that is permanently assigned to this resource, and so it's identifiable. Then a license is also added to the resource, so that somebody else really can see if it's possible to reuse this resource or not. And if it's in a repository that's in a network, the metadata is visible from outside, and you can query the metadata also from other services, as for example this VLO that we have shown. So the chance that your resource gets more visibility is higher. So to conclude, if you're working with language resources in your research or in teaching and training, CLARIN can help you in different steps in this data management lifecycle. And the benefits of CLARIN is that you can reuse already language resources that already exist and build on top of these resources your research question. You can annotate them and so on, so you don't have to start from scratch. So it's time and cost effective. You have the accessibility of different types of resources and in different countries, and you have this one-stop shop where you can look for these resources. When you archive it with one of the CLARIN data centers, your data is archived and you don't have to worry about technology changes. The files and your data are readable also later. You can make it discoverable so that other people can build on your research, and make it also citable, so that when you're writing papers and you are talking about the resource, you can cite these resource, and other can go and really know with the data you have worked with, because it's identifiable. And using the CLARIN infrastructure, the resources and the tools, you don't have the problem that tools and data or different tools are not interoperable. You can use these web services and tool chains where somebody else has already thought about how these tools work together, so you don't have to worry about data file conversion and so on. That's all for us now, and we are open for questions.